Right now, the world is holding its breath, and most people don't even realize why. Turn on the television, scroll through your phone, or glance at the headlines, and you'll see one word repeated over and over again: ceasefire. A ceasefire between the United States, Israel, and Iran. To many, that word sounds like relief. It sounds like peace. It sounds like the end of something dangerous. But what if it isn't the end at all? What if this ceasefire is not a victory, but a pause, a silence before something far louder begins? My name is Emma, and today, I want you to understand something most headlines are not explaining clearly enough. This moment we are living through right now is not normal diplomacy. It is not routine politics. It is a fragile pause between powers that have already shown they are willing to strike, retaliate, and escalate without hesitation. For weeks, the world watched tension build. Missiles were launched. Airspace closed. Military forces moved into position across the region. Leaders spoke carefully, but their actions spoke louder. And now, suddenly, we are told everything is calming down, that diplomacy is working, that the danger has passed. But history teaches us something different. Many of the most dangerous conflicts in modern history did not begin with loud explosions. They began with quiet agreements, temporary pauses that gave each side time to regroup, reposition, and prepare for what came next. A ceasefire can create peace, but it can also create opportunity. Opportunity for strategy, for buildup, and for the next phase of conflict. That is why this moment matters. Not because fighting stopped, but because stopping, even temporarily, creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is where the greatest risks live. Behind closed doors, negotiations continue. Military planners reassess targets. Intelligence agencies analyze outcomes. Every side claims victory publicly, but privately they calculate what still needs to be done. And while governments negotiate, ordinary people around the world continue their daily routines, unaware that decisions being made right now could shape the next decade of global stability. Fuel prices, shipping routes, supply chains, food costs, all of these things depend on stability in regions now hanging by a thread. A ceasefire may delay the damage, but it does not erase the tension that caused it. This is why the current pause should not make you comfortable. It should make you alert. Because the most dangerous moments in geopolitics are not always when missiles are flying. Sometimes, the most dangerous moment is when everything suddenly goes quiet, when the world assumes the danger has passed, even though the underlying conflict remains unresolved. And right now, that is exactly where we stand. A fragile pause, a temporary calm, a moment of silence. That could determine what happens next. To understand why today's ceasefire feels so fragile, we have to go back years before the missiles, before the threats, and before the world started talking openly about war. Because in my opinion, the conflict we are seeing today did not begin in 2026. It began more than a decade ago, with a single agreement that was once called a breakthrough for global peace. In 2015, world leaders signed what became known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often shortened to the JCPOA. The agreement was designed to limit Iran's nuclear program and reduce the risk of nuclear weapons development. In exchange, international sanctions against Iran were eased, giving the country access to global markets and economic relief. At the time, many people believed this deal would stabilize the Middle East for years to come. But in my opinion, the agreement was never as stable as it appeared on the surface. It depended heavily on trust, and trust between rival nations is always fragile. Everything changed in 2018. That year, Donald Trump made a decision that reshaped the future of the region. The United States officially withdrew from the nuclear agreement, arguing that the deal did not go far enough to limit Iran's long-term capabilities. This move shocked global leaders and created immediate uncertainty. Sanctions were reimposed, and pressure on Iran intensified. In my opinion, this was the moment when tensions truly began to spiral. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, like pressure building inside a sealed container. After 2018, diplomacy became unpredictable. Talks resumed, then collapsed. Negotiations restarted, then stalled again. Each failure created more distrust. Each delay pushed both sides further apart. Meanwhile, military rhetoric grew stronger. Regional alliances shifted. Defense systems expanded. And beneath the surface, both sides began preparing for scenarios they publicly claimed to want to avoid. In my opinion, this period between 2018 and the early 2020s was not peaceful. It was deceptive. The world saw negotiations and diplomatic meetings, but behind closed doors, strategies were evolving. Every broken negotiation increased suspicion. Every failed compromise made future agreements harder to achieve. And that is the pattern that led directly to the crisis unfolding today. Because once trust disappears, rebuilding it becomes nearly impossible. Nations begin to assume the worst about each other. Leaders make decisions based on fear rather than cooperation. Military planning becomes more aggressive. Diplomatic language becomes more cautious and more guarded. By the time the world reached the mid-2020s, the foundation of the original nuclear agreement had completely eroded. In my opinion, what we are witnessing today is not a sudden conflict. It is the result of years of unresolved tension stacking on top of each other, layer by layer. And that is why understanding 2015 and 2018 is so important. Because the decisions made in those years did not just affect politics at the time. They set the stage for the uncertainty, the instability, and the dangerous silence we are living through right now. Before the current ceasefire, before the rising fears of another major escalation. There was a moment in June 2025 that many people now look back on as the true turning point. Because in my opinion, the conflict we are seeing today cannot be understood without first understanding what became known as the 12-Day War. In early June 2025, tensions that had been building for years suddenly crossed a dangerous threshold. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes targeting what they described as critical nuclear infrastructure inside Iran. These were not warning shots. They were not symbolic gestures. These were direct military operations designed to weaken Iran's nuclear capability and send a message that the red lines had been crossed. For 12 days, the region lived under the constant threat of escalation. Air defenses activated across multiple cities. Military installations went into full readiness. Shipping routes became uncertain. Governments around the world monitored the situation hour by hour, preparing contingency plans in case the conflict spread beyond the region. In my opinion, what made this period so dangerous was not just the strikes themselves, it was the uncertainty about how far the conflict could go. At any moment, retaliation could have expanded the battlefield across borders and triggered a wider regional war. Inside Iran, explosions struck sensitive facilities that had been under international scrutiny for years. Meanwhile, global intelligence agencies tracked troop movements, missile deployments, and communications signals that hinted at possible counterattacks. Financial markets reacted almost immediately. Oil prices fluctuated sharply. Investors pulled back from risk-heavy assets. Airlines rerouted flights away from potential danger zones. Even countries thousands of kilometers away began preparing for supply disruptions. But after 12 days of sustained pressure and growing global anxiety, diplomacy stepped in. On June 24, 2025, a ceasefire agreement was reached. The deal was mediated in part by Qatar, with diplomatic support from international partners who understood how dangerous the situation had become. The announcement of the ceasefire triggered relief across global markets. Headlines shifted from panic to optimism. Political leaders described the agreement as a victory for diplomacy. For many people watching from afar, it felt like the crisis had ended just in time. But in my opinion, that relief may have been premature. Because ceasefires can stop active fighting. But they do not erase the underlying causes of conflict. They freeze tensions temporarily, leaving unresolved issues locked beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, military analysts reviewed the damage assessments. Intelligence officials evaluated what had been destroyed and what remained operational. Governments reassessed strategies, preparing for the possibility that the conflict could restart at any moment. And perhaps most importantly, trust between nations did not improve. It weakened. Each side believed it had achieved something. Each side claimed success. But neither side walked away satisfied enough to consider the conflict truly finished. In my opinion, the 12-day war did not end the crisis. It reshaped it. It changed expectations, hardened positions, and pushed regional tensions to a level where even small miscalculations could trigger major consequences. That is why June 2025 still matters today. Because what looked like peace may have only been the first pause in a much longer confrontation. By the time January 2026 arrived, the pressure inside Iran was no longer just political, it was explosive. Because, in my opinion, what happened inside Iran during this period changed the direction of the conflict just as much as any missile strike or military operation. For years, economic sanctions had strained Iran's economy. Prices rose, jobs became harder to find, basic goods became more expensive. Families struggled to keep up with daily costs, and frustration slowly spread across cities and rural regions alike. But in January 2026, that frustration reached a breaking point. Large-scale protests erupted across multiple cities, streets filled with demonstrators demanding economic relief, political reforms, and greater freedoms. Many observers compared these demonstrations to the unrest that once shook the country during the Iranian Revolution, one of the most significant turning points in modern Middle Eastern history. This was not a small protest movement. It was widespread, organized, and persistent. Crowds gathered day after day, despite warnings from authorities. Videos circulated online showing massive gatherings, chants echoing through city streets, and security forces deploying in large numbers. In my opinion, what made this moment so dangerous was not just the size of the protests, it was the government's response. Iranian security forces moved quickly to regain control. Reports began emerging of crackdowns, arrests, and the use of force against demonstrators. The situation escalated rapidly. What started as protests soon turned into violent confrontations between civilians and armed forces. As the days passed, the numbers became more alarming. Thousands were reported dead or injured. Entire neighborhoods experienced lockdowns. Communication networks were disrupted in certain areas, making it harder for information to move freely. Fear spread just as quickly as anger, and the world was watching. Governments across the globe monitored the situation closely, concerned that internal instability inside Iran could create ripple effects far beyond its borders. A weakened or unstable government in such a strategically important country carries risks that reach into global markets, security alliances, and regional stability. In response to the escalating crisis, the United States began taking visible action. Military assets were repositioned. Additional forces were deployed across the Middle East. Intelligence operations intensified. Analysts later described this buildup as the largest American military presence in the region since the 2003 Iraq War. In my opinion, this buildup signaled something important. Preparation, not just observation. Because military forces are rarely moved on that scale without expectation of further escalation. Even if diplomacy remained active, the presence of additional troops created a clear message. The situation was no longer being treated as a temporary disturbance. Inside Iran, the protests continued to reshape the political landscape. Leadership faced mounting pressure, both from citizens and from international scrutiny. The government focused on restoring control, while external powers focused on managing the potential fallout. And that combination, internal unrest combined with external military readiness, created one of the most volatile environments the region had seen in years. In my opinion, January 2026 was not just another chapter in the conflict. It was the moment when internal instability and international tension collided. Because when a nation faces unrest within its borders, while powerful rivals gather strength outside them, the risk of escalation increases dramatically. And that is exactly the environment that set the stage for everything that followed next. So when you step back and look at everything that has happened so far, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. What we are witnessing today did not begin with missiles or explosions. It began years earlier, with decisions that slowly reshaped the balance of power across the region. It began in 2015, with the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a deal that many believed would reduce tensions and create long-term stability between United States and Iran. But in my opinion, that stability was always fragile. Because just 3 years later, in 2018, when Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement, the trust that held the deal together began to collapse. Sanctions returned. Diplomacy became unpredictable. And tensions that once lived quietly in the background began moving into the spotlight. Then came June 2025, the moment when tension turned into direct action. The 12-day war between United States, Israel, and Iran shocked the world. Airstrikes targeted sensitive locations. Military systems activated across borders. Global markets trembled as uncertainty spread from one region to the next. When a ceasefire was finally reached on June 24th, mediated with help from Qatar, the world breathed a sigh of relief. But in my opinion, that relief created a dangerous illusion. The illusion that the crisis had ended. Because beneath the surface, nothing had truly been resolved. And then came January 2026, a moment that shifted the conflict in an entirely new direction. Inside Iran, massive protests erupted, echoing unrest not seen since the Iranian Revolution. Streets filled with anger. Security forces moved in. Violence escalated. Thousands were reported killed or injured, and the internal pressure on the Iranian government reached levels that alarmed leaders around the world. At the same time, the United States began repositioning forces across the region, the largest military buildup since the 2003 Iraq War. In my opinion, this was the moment when the conflict stopped being theoretical and started becoming inevitable. Because when internal instability meets external military preparation, the margin for error becomes dangerously small. That brings us to February 2026, the final opportunity to prevent what came next. Diplomatic talks resumed quietly, moving through intermediaries in Oman. Officials spoke publicly about progress. Statements were issued suggesting that solutions were within reach. But behind those statements, uncertainty remained. Negotiations stalled. Trust remained weak. Each side questioned the intentions of the other. And while diplomats continued speaking, military planners were already preparing for scenarios that diplomacy might fail to stop. In my opinion, this was the last moment when peace was still possible. Because once negotiations collapse after years of mistrust, the next step is rarely conversation. It is confrontation. And that is exactly where the world was standing, right on the edge of a decision that would soon change everything.